right, welcome to the webinar. My name is Keith Harris, and today we'll be providing principles for assessing threats on campuses for K through 12 schools and universities. Again, my name is Keith Harris. I'm the marketing manager for Lenssec, and I'll be your moderator today. Let me tell you a little bit about Lenssec. Since 1998, Lenssec has been a trusted security and surveillance partner with experience in the U.S. and around the world. Lenssec has a background working with many types of industries. We help customers develop enterprise solutions for complex physical security projects. We've developed a powerful security platform called Perspective Video Management Software. This enterprise VMS streams and captures IP security video and incorporates video analytics, access control, and more into the software. I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment. First, I need to go over a few logistics. We will take our questions at the end of the webinar, and as you have those questions, go ahead and enter them into the GoToWebinar panel, and we'll collect those and ask our speaker about those at the end of the presentation. We'll present a few poll questions during the event. We encourage your participation in answering those. And at the end of the webinar, we'll present a survey for you to answer a few questions for us to help us better serve you in the future. If you're interested in a completion certificate, you can indicate your wishes on the survey, and we'll follow up in a few days with the webinar certificates. We'll answer any questions in that email we'll send out to you as well, and send you a copy of today's presentation. We do record these webinars, and we'll post them on our website and provide you a link to our webinar video archive. Today's physical security expert is Gary L. Sigrist, Jr. Gary is a nationally known speaker, a consultant, an author, and an expert on emergency preparedness. During his 30-year career, he's been an educator, an administrator, and a police officer. His background gives him a unique point of view on safety and preparedness for education environments. Gary is the president and CEO of Safeguard Risk Solutions. The company helps its clients identify vulnerabilities, plan accordingly, train thoroughly, and respond effectively. Thanks for joining us today, Gary.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate Lenssec for giving me the opportunity to be here and to share with our participants today some of the information that they can use to help keep their campuses safe. All right, so I have the screen now. So if you'll give me just a second, let's get that moving. Let's see here. Struggling with technology. There we go. All right, so I appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to attend this webinar. As a retired school administrator, I know how valuable our time is. We will stick to a hard target of 1 hour. We will answer all the questions that we can, and if we don't get to all your questions, then we'll make sure that we answer those questions and send them out. So, as Keith said, I've been trained by a couple of groups on threat assessments, and threat assessments are the recommended manner or practice recommended by the Secret Service as a way to reduce our risk of targeted attacks. And so what we'll do is we'll look at, what are the phases of an active shooter incident, and we're going to talk about how do we prevent, how do we assess mental health risk, and profiling for potential threats. Now, we use the word profiling in a couple of different ways. It's more of a way of being observant to look for people who may be on the pathway to violence. This is probably one of the biggest areas of concern, not just in K-12 and on university campuses, but also it's risk to businesses as well. We probably in this country have one of our greatest failings is we're not doing a very good job with mental health issues. And so a lot of times people who are having mental health issues can sometimes be on a pathway to violence, and there's really no help for getting them off. So we'll talk about that today as well. So the screen. So if you haven't already seen this here, this is the the Secret Service Safe School Initiative, and it came out in 2004. It was partially in response to the Columbine shootings. I really believe that any organization should, if they haven't already, read this document, because it will describe quite a few of the things that we'll talk about today. I list Marissa Reddy here. Her name is now Marissa Randazzo. She is who I took the majority of my training. Her company is who I took the majority of my training from. But Marissa was one of the authors for this document. So when I've taken my training from her, I've taken it for K-12, higher ed, and then also business applications for threat assessments. So people will always say on the news, you know, there'll be an incident, and the news will interview a friend of the assailant, and they'll say, you know, he was just such a nice guy, he must have just snapped. And in reality, people don't snap. These are not random or impulse incidents. What we've seen in many of these incidents, not just in the United States, but also abroad, some of these attacks are well planned for up to a year before the event even takes place. And what's important is, when you're dealing with K-12 and higher ed, is understanding that in almost every case, somebody had concerns. Maybe it was because of the person's behaviors or something that person said to the people around them. And what a threat assessment does is it really allows us to connect the dots when we look at incidents that are happening or behaviors that are occurring. So I can remember after Columbine, people would say to me, okay, Gary, we're concerned about our school being the next school to have an attack. What will the students look like that we should be concerned about? Will they be wearing, you know, all black trench coats like they did in Columbine? And those of you that have studied Columbine, you'll know from reading the reports that the two shooters were often called part of the trench coat mafia. And they even said, you know, you called us the trench coat mafia. That's a name you gave us. We wore trench coats to prepare you for always seeing us in a trench coat, so that when the day that we brought our weapons to school hidden under the trench coat, you wouldn't think anything about that. So don't look at a person's appearance. We look at their behavior, because the Secret Service has said over and over again, there is no unique profile for an attacker, whether this is K-12, higher ed, or the workplace. There are behaviors that cause us to have concern. Subjects are sometimes suicidal or display desperation before the attacks. Now, in a K-12 and in a college environment, because of the age group, students, young adults don't understand that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And so if you have somebody talking about suicide, that's a warning sign, especially if you couple it with the fact that so many people who commit targeted acts of violence kill themselves at the end. Those of you that have been watching the news this week, at the airport in Oklahoma, a person was discharged from work. They were fired from the company they worked for. They sat in wait, and they shot and killed the supervisor they blamed, and then killed themselves. So if you have a student or employee talking about suicide, that's a warning sign. It doesn't mean that they're on a pathway to violence. It doesn't mean that they're going to do a targeted act of violence, but it means that that person needs some help. And so using a threat assessment approach, we can determine the right course of action to help that person. So let's do our first poll question, just to make sure that I haven't put you to sleep in the first 5 minutes of our webinar. So, is an active shooter event typically well planned, or is it spontaneous? So if you'll answer the poll questions. I'll do my very best Ben Stein impersonation. Anybody? Bueller.
We're doing pretty good on responses here. People have responded quickly, so most people have had a chance to vote. So let's go ahead and close the poll and launch it and show you what the results are.
And do you need to take over the screen because I'm not seeing it?
Yes. Oh, that's right. I forget. You can't see it. Our answer here is well planned. 100%
Yes.
of the responders
they
are showing well planned.
Yeah. Very good. They are well planned events. So, and what's nice is the longer they plan, the more likely there's going to be something called leakage, where we're going to find out some of their intent. So when we look at the phases of an active shooter event, we start with conceptualization. This is fantasy. This is somebody just thinking, I don't like this person in my class. I don't like this teacher. I don't like this college. I don't like who I work with, and I'd like to do them harm. And so unless you're a mind reader, there's really not a lot we can do. However, let's say that you're a college professor and you hear a student walking down the hall and they say, I want to kill Professor so-and-so. Okay, that requires a response. We're going to have to evaluate that the person just made a threat, and we have to evaluate that threat. In a K-12 environment, it'd be a little different. A student walks out of my classroom and says, I'm going to kill Mr. Sigrist. The teacher beside me hears him and says, excuse me, what did you just say? I said I was going to kill Mr. Sigrist. Okay, what's going on here? Well, I just flunked a test in his class. And so the teacher says, well, do you really want to kill him? No, I'm angry. Okay, so let's have a conversation then. Let's go down to the office. Let's talk to the principal. Let's make sure we kind of denote this happened. We're going to call your parents, and we're going to tell them, your child was angry and said something they shouldn't have said. We're not looking to suspend the child. We're not looking to expel the child. We're not looking to give the child an after-school detention or lunch detention. They made a threat. We evaluate the threat, and then we move on, provided that it's a transient threat. Now, when it gets to the next stage, planning, who, what, where, and when, are they getting weapons? Is there possible leakage? So if a student says, I'm going to kill Mr. Sigrist, and that's all they say, and then they say, I'm going to kill Mr. Sigrist, and I know that he eats lunch by himself every day in his classroom at 11 o'clock. And my grandfather keeps a shotgun in the basement, and the keys to the shotgun are in the tackle box in the garage. And okay, so now we're starting to put more details. So now we kind of bring this up a little bit. When they start obtaining weapons, when they have this thing of leakage, they tell somebody. Students, up until about the age of 24, 25, your prefrontal cortex is not fully matured, and so your amygdala that controls your emotions, and I know this is science nerd stuff, but they actually believe, okay, I'm going to tell my friend because I have to tell somebody, but I'll swear them to secrecy, and so they tell that person. Well, that person can't keep a secret either. And so that's where we get this leakage where people start to know. And they actually did the bystander study after the Secret Service Safe School Initiative, and they found out that in every school shooting there was leakage. Students knew that the event was going to take place, and when they were asked, why didn't you tell anyone, the answers ranged from, well, I didn't know who to tell, my dad told me to mind my own business, I was afraid if I told I'd get in trouble too. So when we look at this, conceptualization, planning, preparation, and then the approach is, what if they're on their way? We're kind of hoping that someone's going to stop them randomly before they get there, and then implementation, they're at the door. Now, this is where a lot of people will say to you, I've got the perfect solution for you for when there's an active shooter in your building. Well, really, that's too late. That means somebody's going to die. What we want to try to do is we want to stop this event ahead of time. And we're most likely to catch these people in the planning and preparation stage because of this thing called leakage. I will tell you that there's less leakage in adults. So if you're a workplace and you want to talk about it, the leakage is less, but there are still behaviors that these people engage in that will cause you concern, that will say to you, I think what we need to do is we need to start a threat assessment process. So, what is a threat? It's an expression or intent to harm someone. So a threat assessment is evaluating this threat. This is what the U.S. Secret Service uses to protect our president and other dignitaries. If there's a threat, they evaluate that threat, and then based on that threat, they determine whether or not the threat is a legitimate threat or not. So, why is it we want to have this? Well, first of all, we know that a targeted attack can be prevented. We're seeing this happen throughout the United States on a regular basis. Almost once a month, a targeted act of violence is prevented because somebody heard something, somebody saw something, something made somebody nervous, and they acted upon it. The problem is without a threat assessment team, the information might be scattered, so we have to connect the dots. So as soon as we have the threat, we act quickly, and we start putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Now, I know I'm going through this kind of quickly, but the nice thing is you'll get a copy of this presentation. So those of you that are trying to take copious notes, please know that we're going to send you this PowerPoint so that you'll have it. So what we're asking in a threat assessment is we're not asking, is this person violent? Is this person on a pathway to violence? And so if they're on a pathway to violence, we're gonna use a team to gather as much information as possible and intervene if it's necessary. Now, you don't always have to put your threat assessment team together just because there was a threat. For example, if we go back to the example where a student walks out of my room and he says, hey, I'm a little bit angry at Mr. Sigrist, or I'm going to kill Mr. Sigrist, and so we just talked to the principal. You just did a threat assessment, but you didn't have to bring your whole team together. It's important to understand that threat assessment and case management is not an adversarial process. In other words, we're not doing a threat assessment to prove anything. What we want to do is we want to create an engagement with the person who we're concerned about so that we can prevent harm from happening. So some people say, well, let's do a threat assessment. If we find out the student is a threat, then we'll expel him from school. That's a bad idea. That's not our end goal, is to expel a child from school. If we remove a child or an adult from school, that doesn't mean the problem goes away. We saw this happen within the last couple of years. A person was fired from a news station, and he came back and shot and killed another reporter a couple years later after he'd been fired. So just because you remove the problem doesn't mean the threat's over. I'd rather have the person in the school situation so that they can be monitored. So, next poll question. A mental health assessment of a threatening student helps do what? And you're going to be given some choices here. Evaluate a person's risk for violence, evaluate a risk of targeted attack, or an administration of developing a risk plan.
Right. The other thing to note, Gary, is that in addition to the PowerPoint presentation, as we mentioned off the top of the webinar, we also will have a recording of this available that we'll email you about as well. So if you need to come back and take notes, you'll have a recording that you can refer to, so that may be helpful.
Well, I'll tell you the other nice thing, Keith, is that if you're an administrator and you're watching this, and you say, this might be a good thing to share with my staff, share the link once the recording's made available, and then your staff members can watch this and get some good information.
Right. Most of our attendees have voted here, so let me close the poll and I'll share the results. We're showing 43% say evaluate a person's risk for violence. Another 43% say evaluate a risk of targeted attack. And then 14% say administration needs to develop a risk plan.
Okay,
so the correct answer there is number one, evaluate a person's risk for violence.
Right, so it's going to be part of the process. So here's what happens. So mental health risk assessment is part of it. And I always have to, this is what makes me nervous in our country, is one, we don't have enough mental health professionals, and then number two, some people are afraid to go see a mental health professional because it'll be looked upon negatively about them. And we know that that's not a true statement. I can just tell you from my own personal life, I lost both my parents to diseases, and in doing so, it caused me a lot of concern. And so I went to a professional to talk about how do I deal with these people how do I deal with these feelings that I have, losing my parents? So that didn't mean I was on a pathway to violence. And some people say, well, if I go get mental health treatment, people will think something is wrong with me, and that's not the case. So, sometimes we want to just send people as part of treatment to see, okay, this person is on a pathway to violence due to some issues. Let's see if we can resolve these issues so that they can be taken off, or they can get off that pathway to violence. So it's not instead of a threat assessment, but it's part of it. So if we believe a person is on a pathway to violence, we say, okay, here's one of the things we'd like you to do so that we can re-engage you in our school. We'd like you to go see a mental health professional. The second thing is the automated decision-making process, and I used to use this all the time as an 8th grade teacher. If a student was tardy, the first time they got a warning, the second time they got a written warning, the third time they gave an after-school detention, and it was just automated. And the problem is that in a threat assessment situation, every situation is different, and what we need to do is not just look at the behavior, but look at the totality of the circumstances. What may be causing the behavior? What's leading the person to behave in that manner? Profiling. This is here it is. Part of it because of what we see on TV with profilers. Most of the time, when you see profiling used in TV or even in real life, if you have a series of crimes being committed, you look at the traits of the offense and then you try to base a profile on who might be doing this. The problem is the number of suspects is incredibly large. In fact, I jokingly tell law enforcement when I teach this class to law enforcement, a lot of us would fit a profile just based on the jobs that we do and why we went into law enforcement. So profiling is not a way of predictive behavior, and as the Secret Service says, there's no profile of it. So when you profile, you gather data, you identify common characteristics, you compare the person in question with the composite, and then okay, this person may actually be somebody who's committing a crime, but that doesn't mean that they're on a pathway to violence. So it's going to identify more people that match the profile but aren't a threat, and it fails to identify a person whose behavior suggests a real concern. So profiling, not a good thing. So that takes us to the threat assessment process, and what it starts out is I have a concern about a person. Why do I have this concern about this person? It's because of their behaviors, not the way they dress, not the music they listen to. It's something in their behavior. Once we have that person of concern, we try to get as much information as possible, then we assess it and we manage the situation. If they truly are a risk, what we're going to do is we're going to manage that risk. So it's based on facts. It's an objective process, not a subjective process. So it's evidence-based. It's from the Secret Service. It's part of the Safe School Initiative. The FBI research regarding workplace violence, there's actually studies done. This has been used successfully to prevent campus, school, and workplace violence. Okay, so we use it because we know that prevention is possible. Okay, if we look through the steps of an active shooter or a targeted act of violence, we know that people follow this behavior, and if they're following that behavior, we'll have the ability to observe their behaviors, and that's what will justify our reason for doing a threat assessment. We're not asking, is the person violent? We're asking, are they on the pathway to violence? So when we're looking at that, what is making this person behave in the way that they do? And we could, college students, for example, might be overwhelmed because of the freedom that they have had at school, but then college itself is overwhelming, and then they may get into alcohol or other drugs, and so there's a totality of the circumstances that put them on this pathway to violence. And if we can look at the circumstances and say, okay, this is why you're on that pathway, what can we do to change that pathway so that you're not feeling this? Now, when we talk about, it's really the, I need to move this here. When we're talking about this, we talk about, what's going on in the building, what's going on at that campus. And so when we look at, who is the subject, who is the person on the pathway, do you have vulnerabilities at your location? People will sometimes say that targeted acts of violence are all caused by bullying, and that's not true. But if you have a large amount of bullying in your organization, then that could be a sign that you have a toxic environment. And so what we need to do is we need to change our environment. In your building, in your facilities, do you have areas where people are feeling they're harassed, bullied, picked on? So what does our environment look like? And then what are the precipitating events that may trigger reactions? For example, we often see bomb threats happen on a more regular basis during a finals week, because that threat is being made because people are concerned about a test, etc. So you got to put the totality of the circumstances together when we're deciding what our threat is. We have to have corroboration, multiple sources, be skeptical, have an advocate for the person who is being evaluated. So if you're looking, for example, let's say that you're in a college situation or even a high school situation, and you've got a student who has caused concerns, and so you pull that student's transcripts and you find that their grades are C's and D's, but they've had this one instructor multiple times and their grades are B's and A's. And well, that person might be someone who is very good to talk to, of saying, hey, this student isn't doing well in other classes, but they do well in yours and they've taken you multiple times. What can you tell us about this student? And they might give you some background information, such as, well, I know his parents are going through a divorce, or I know he's struggling with financial aid to afford college. Those are the things that give you background information as to issues that may be causing the person to behave the way they do, because it's behaviors, it's not profiles. We're not looking about the way they dress. What behaviors are they doing that says somebody may be on a pathway and they need some assistance? We want to help that person so that they are no longer a threat. So multiple communications, there's got to be identification, gathering information, assessment. We got to manage the referrals. Sometimes we're going to team with local agencies, especially law enforcement. In Ohio, I know that we've had a lot of success in preventing targeted acts of violence, not just in K-12 and in higher ed, but in any time where we think that there's a threat to the people around them. If a person has access to weapons, those weapons can be removed from the person's ability to use them while the process is going on. And that's why, if you really think that you have a serious substantive threat, then gosh, we probably need to involve law enforcement, because this person may cause more harm than just to the school itself. So people will ask me, well, Gary, how do I kind of judge all of this? Well, how can I articulate what my concerns are? And so we use this chart here called the 4 Ds. And so if somebody is impacted by actual perceived situations, stressors, or traumatic events, and they're abusing substances, doing self-medication, and they have suicidal thoughts, and they are unable to care for themselves, what we can do is we can say, okay, we can now articulate why we have the concerns that we do. So critical question is about, are they on the pathway? Focus is not solely on whether they made a threat. So sometimes they don't even make a threat. Sometimes we look at people and say, and this is real important in businesses, because remember, there may not be a leakage. A 35-year-old person is not going to engage in leakage the same way a 19, 18 college student might engage in leakage. So we don't necessarily have to have the threat. We have to have behaviors that make us say, something's not right here. So just because they made a threat or didn't make a threat doesn't mean they're a threat. You have to look at totality. We want to make sure that we keep the victims in mind. Remember, we're trying to protect the victim of this from happening. So if we have early identification and intervention, it helps everyone. We get a greater range of options. We might not have to involve the legal system. False positives are more rapidly cleared. It's simple, easy, direct. It's critical reporting. There has to be multiple ways that people can report. One of the things that we talk about in the K-12 environment, but you could also do this both in higher ed and in the workplace, is anonymous reporting systems, so that if I have a concern, I'm able to share that concern with somebody else. Because if you see a behavior, let's say that I'm a college freshman, and there's a person in my dorm who's engaging in behaviors that kind of creeps me out a little bit or makes me feel uncomfortable, and so I report that to the university, well, that person may already be being watched or evaluated by the university themselves because of behavior that was raised a concern with an instructor. So what we're starting to do is we are starting to make it easier to connect the dots. So let me just. So it's multifaceted resources, maximize effectiveness through sustained, coordinated efforts. You know, we have to look at what are the factors that are causing it, so we can change those factors to cause that's causing the person to be on the pathway. Safety is the most important thing, and so the assessment and management steps are the tools that towards the goal of safety. So who's going to be on our threat assessment team? And I've just used a K-12 environment here. You know, the principal, whoever has the ability to call the ball, teachers, counselors, coaches, the SRO. I want to remind you that you want to have an advocate for that student, someone who can vouch for them. If it's in the workplace, it might be a friend. You know, a lot of times we talk about, you know, workplace violence or targeted acts of violence. The perpetrator could very easily be an employee of the school or university, so it's important that we have advocates for them. This is what the Secret Service talks about. You know, we have to start with an intent. Okay, so, you know, does somebody want to do something, and then do they have the ability? So, you know, here's, for example, would be a threat that you might see in an elementary school. The student gets angry and says, I'm going to go home and I'm going to get some explosives and I'm going to blow up the building. So we have the intent, but obviously that person doesn't have the ability. Sometimes we'll see thresholds crossed. So, for example, a lot of schools have a no weapons, K-12 of course. Some colleges are allowed to have firearms, but let's say that the rule is there are to be no firearms and no weapons. And so in a K-12 environment, a student might bring a knife to school, first to see if they can get away with bringing the knife, and then second to see what the consequences are for having that knife. You know, if they can talk their way out of having a knife, then that means it'll be easier for me to bring in a firearm. There has to be a compliance with risk reduction. You know, I will say this over and over and over again. Our goal in the threat assessment team is not to remove the student from the school setting. Our goal is to keep that child engaged so that we can keep an eye on that child or that young adult. If we remove them from the school setting, we no longer can monitor their behaviors, nor can we offer treatment solutions. So it is very important that we try to keep that person engaged. However, in a K-12 environment, you have a student who says, I'm going to come to school and I'm going to shoot a bunch of people. So to me, that's going to involve your threat assessment team, including law enforcement. You're going to include the parents. So the parents come in and the parents say, look, I don't care what you say, you guys, this is just another example of you picking on my child, and we're not going to have our child go get counseling, and we're not going to do anything. If you don't want us in the school, fine, we're gone. Okay, as an organization, there's nothing you can do at that point. But if you have parents that say, look, we are seeing some of the same behaviors that you're seeing. We want our child to get help. Help us help our child. Well, then now you have compliance. So these are things that you have to understand as you go through the process. And, you know, concern by others, we've talked about that as well. So this is a nice flowchart. I had to break it up into a couple pieces, but this kind of quantifies our process that we go through. So we have a person of concern, and we conduct a screening. And the question is this an imminent situation? Do we believe that this person is going to cause harm to themselves or the school? And if the answer is yes, we got to call law enforcement. Okay. If the answer is no, we're going to conduct triage. We're going to evaluate. We're going to look, are there concerns? No. So we're closing document. So if the answer is yes, we're going to do an inquiry and we're going to make an assessment. If they pose a threat, then we're going to say, okay, we got to develop and implement a plan, and we got to monitor the plan. Or no, do they need help? Yep. So let's get them help. And if they don't need help, let's close and document. And if they do, we keep them in the process until we believe that person is no longer a risk. We create a safety plan. We make sure that the students are following the safety plan, and we constantly monitor the situation. What's interesting is the Virginia Tech shooting was believed to be a threat while he was in school, in K-12, and high school especially. And so they were constantly monitoring him and his behavior. So when did he commit the offense? When he was in college. Now, this is not to throw the college under the bus or to say they did anything wrong. They weren't aware of this. Had the school been able to connect the dots, they would have seen the concerns. I mean, he lived in a quad with 3 other guys, and none of them knew he spoke English. He had threatened or was harassing a girl the year before. There was a professor who had some very serious concerns about the shooter, but nobody connected the dots. When he was in high school, they kept the dots connected, and I think I sometimes believe that if they had not had a threat assessment team when he was in high school, he might have committed the offense when he was in high school versus committing it in college. So here's our next question. What is a transient threat? Because we're going to start looking at threats now.
All right, so the poll question is launched. Our choices are threat. The threat is committed by a person not regularly on campus. The threat to kill a faculty member or a student. Or the threat is not expressing lasting intent to harm another person. So make your choices there, and we'll show the results of the poll. All right, I think the majority of folks have voted here, so let's go ahead and close the polls and show the results. All right, the results that we've got here say that 63% of our folks say the threat is committed by a person not regularly on campus. 13% say it's a threat to kill a faculty member or a student, and 25% say the threat is not expressing lasting intent to harm another person. So what's the right answer there, Gary?
Right answer is going to be number 3. This is the mildest threat that you can have. And so what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to classify our threats. So, you know, transient threat versus substantive threat, and then is it serious or very serious? So if we look at these, you know, here's an example. And this is we won't necessarily do a poll, but okay. So a student is angry at another student and says, "I'm going to kill you." So during an interview, the student says, "I have no plans to harm the other student, and I lost my temper," and he agrees to apologize. So is this no threat, transient threat, serious substantive, or very serious substantive? And of course, most people say, "Well, this is a kid being a kid." This is a transient threat. I mean, it has no real weight to it. We talked to the kid. He said he was angry. We're going to call the parents. Okay, if this is a K-12 setting, we're going to call the parents and we're going to have a conversation with the parents. Your child said he was going to kill somebody. We don't believe that your child was intending on killing anybody. However, this is not the kind of language we use at school, and we would like you to reinforce that message at home. So now we have two students argue, and one punches another. So during the interview, the student says he should not have lost his temper, but that he acted in self-defense. Now this is a trick question. No threat, transient threat, serious substantive threat, or very serious. And some of you want to say, well, this to me sounds like a serious substantive threat, when in reality, it was no threat. He didn't say, I'm going to punch you, and then punches him. He just went ahead and hit him. This is unacceptable behavior, and it's going to be dealt with. But it's going to be dealt with as a school rule violation, not necessarily as a threat assessment situation. So, I think we just have a duplicate slide. Okay. No. I had a bad slide there. Okay, so let's look at this one. A student makes a list and says these people are scheduled to die. Now, most people are going to jump right ahead and say, yeah, this is a very serious substantive threat. Look at it this way. If something is important to us, grocery shopping lists, the reason we create those lists is because this is important. If somebody creates a list that says scheduled to die, this is a serious substantive threat. So we look at it two different ways. We have a discipline code, and then we have a duty to protect. So all of these students violated the district code, but that's not a threat assessment. In our threat assessment, how do we protect people that are at risk? So what we look at is if we have a threat and it's a serious substantive threat, then we go through these three steps. We want to control and contain the situation so that it doesn't happen. We want to protect the possible targets. And for me, the third and most important thing is, how do we help that person who's on a pathway to violence? I'll go back to what I said earlier. Let's take a college student who is threatening to do harm to another student. If we just remove that student from the campus, that doesn't resolve the threat to the other student. All it does is separate them. We want to make sure that whatever's causing this person to be on a pathway to violence, we want to take them off that. Now, people are saying, well, let's talk about FERPA for a second. You know, should we warn somebody if there's a threat? And the answer is absolutely correct. After Virginia Tech, because there were some questions about whether or not they could notify the students of the possible threat. Because some people say, well, if you give any information, then that's a FERPA violation. So let me just help you clarify this just a little bit. Let's say that I have a high school student, and another student threatens my high school student, and it's at the end of the day, and the school says, we need you to come and pick up your son. Somebody threatened to do harm to your son, and we believe the threat is real. Is the school allowed to tell me that child's name? And the answer is yes, because that child poses a risk to my child. So it could be a child that lives in the neighborhood. And so they believed it was a serious enough threat to let me know, but if I don't know who the person is, then I let my son go outside and now he's at risk of this child again, then really it didn't do me any good to pick him up from school if he's still at risk in the neighborhood. So if you can articulate the reason that you're releasing this information is for the safety of the students, it is not a FERPA violation. Now, let's say that the threat occurred to my son 3 weeks ago and the school never bothered to tell me. And I go into school and the principal says, oh, by the way, your son was threatened a few weeks ago. And I said, well, who threatened him? Well, now the principal can't tell me because the threat has since passed. It has to be almost, as in law enforcement, an exigent circumstance, a special circumstance. Because the threat is 3 weeks old, it's no longer a valid threat because of the time that has passed. So talk to your district or your university lawyers, and they'll clarify this. But we put a link there that the U.S. Department of Education put out right after or shortly after Virginia Tech shooting, so that people would better understand FERPA. So now here we go. We're going to practice responding to threats. So that the student that says, I'm going to kill you, we said it's transient, so what's the next thing we're going to do? So we take a look at our choices there, and people are reading through them. And the correct answer, of course, is refer the students for conflict mediation. Still going to call the parent and say, hey, your child said something they shouldn't, but we're going to figure out why these two aren't getting along and give them the skills that they can use then to get along or to at least not threaten each other. So two students argue, one punches the other, the student has assaulted the classmate, but he hasn't expressed any harm. This was that trick question we used. He lost his temper. What are we going to do? Well, we know that the first one's not correct. We got to take some action because he violated the school rule, and he's going to need to be disciplined. So when we look at these answers, really the answers that we're going to do is we're going to discipline the student, we're going to see if they still want to fight, and we want to refer them to conflict mediation. So a student tells another student that he's going to beat somebody up after school in a parking lot. He's uncooperative and says, what I do after school is my own business. So we said this was a serious substantive threat. So what are we going to do? Now, a lot of people are looking at these answers and they say, well, he threatened another student. Let's go ahead and arrest the student. Well, really, that's the one answer that we're not going to do because we don't have enough information just based on that to even make an arrest. So we want to notify the intended victim. We're going to try to refer the student to mental health assessment, and we're going to take protective action by notifying the student's parents and have them take their son home after school. Again, this is that FERPA thing. I'm going to notify the parents who the intended assailant is, and because I can articulate that the reason I'm letting this have this information, that student's name, is because that child poses a risk to their child. So it's an exigent circumstance, and under exigent circumstances, we can release information. So a student makes a list with names scheduled to die. You know, we all said that this was a serious substantive threat because, after all, we made a list. We look down here, and there are 4 answers, and only one of them we would never do. And if you've heard me say this over and over again, we are not going to expel that child. That is not our end goal. We may have to expel that child. If the parents are uncooperative, if the child is uncooperative, if we can't create a safety plan that guarantees the safety of the students and staff, we can't have that child in school. That shouldn't be our end goal. That should be the exception, not the rule. So when we look at this, you know, listen, watch, report. We got to develop a culture where students can speak up. It's okay to talk about things, and you know, if their peers are saying, and this is the one that I worry about because I deal with this with some of my clients. You know, they've been plagued with a lot of suicides, and a lot of times, you know, I can remember when I was a kid, kids would say, "I'm going to kill myself," and we'd say, "Oh, that person's just joking." Well, you know what? Sometimes they're not, and so if you have a concern, that's where we need to share that concern. We have to let our faculty know that if there's a concern, we have a process to address that concern. A lot of times principals or teachers will say, well, they never do anything when a child threatens. Well, if there's a threat assessment team in place, there's a process. And as I said earlier, make sure that you have some form of anonymous reporting. So when we look at this, threat assessments, it's recommended by the U.S. Secret Service and the Department of Education. It's preventive measures, not reactive measures. It's designed to protect the victim and, most importantly, get help for that person that is on their way to violence. And at this time, we'll open up the questions.
All right, yes, and you do have a few moments to get your questions in if you'd like to. It looks like we have about 10 minutes left in the webinar. So if you want to submit some questions, go ahead and type those in and get them over to us. To start, let's take a look at, this is a really good question. How does the threat assessment team fit into the 4 phases of emergency management?
Okay, and that is a great question, because what this does is It's in the planning stage. It's in the prevention stage. What we want to make sure is that if there is a threat, we have a way of handling that threat. So those of you that are familiar with or not familiar, it's prevention and mitigation. So how do we prevent something from happening? If something does happen, how do we mitigate the damage? How do we plan for an event? How do we respond, and how do we recover? So in your emergency operation plans, you should have how do we deal with a threat. So if there's a threat that occurs in your school, in your university, you're able to say, okay, if a student makes a threat, we follow this protocol. And it begins with evaluating the threat. Is it a transient threat? Is it a substantive threat? Is it serious? Is it very serious? And your level of engagement with your threat assessment team will be determined by the level of threat. The greater the risk, the more people you're going to have to involve, including first responders. And by first responders, I mean primarily your law enforcement.
Right, okay. Next question, why do we want to keep a student who's made a threat in school? Wouldn't it be safer to expel the student to keep them away from other children?
That's a lot of people believe that, and the problem with that line of thinking is we can't monitor a child's behavior if we can't see that child. And think about it, if you have a student who is 14, 15, 16, 17 years in high school, for example, and we've expelled them from school because of their behaviors. Their parents were uncooperative. Or even if their parents were cooperative, we just said, we don't care, we don't want your child here. Chances are that parent works, and so now that child is home alone for extended periods of time. Because we haven't allowed that child to be re-engaged with the school, they could be plotting, okay, this is how I'm going to get back at these people. But if we say to them, because if you talk to most students, and I don't care whether you're in college or K-12 environment, nobody says, zippity-doo-dah, I got to go to school every day. But by the same token, they like being in school. It's a way to engage with their friends, etc. And so if we know that, and we say to them, look, we want you to be here, but in order for you to be here, you're going to have to do certain things. We had a second grader one time who pulled a knife on another student on the bus. And, when I say pull a knife, he had a knife and said, look, here's a knife, and he pointed it at a child. Some people will say, well, that child should be expelled. Well, if you're under the age of 8 in Ohio, we can't even charge you with a crime. But what we did do is we said, okay, we can't guarantee safety on the bus because you would take a one-on-one aid. So the child wasn't allowed to ride the bus. Parents had to take the child for counseling, and they had to waive their HIPAA rights so that we could talk to the counselor to make sure that the child was no longer a threat. And then every day when that child came to school, very discreetly he went into the office and his book bag was checked and it was made sure that he didn't have any weapons. So what we did is we kept that child in school, but there was a safety plan to keep that child engaged and everybody safe.
All right. Are threat assessment teams effective in preventing targeted acts of school violence?
The Secret Service says that it is the #1 way to prevent targeted acts of violence. What we're able to do is we're able to articulate where we have a concern and then create a safety plan that allows us to keep all the students and staff safe and at the same time get help for that student who is on a pathway to violence, get the help that they need. And that is critical. We want them to get the help that they need. And that doesn't matter if it's K-12, it doesn't matter if it's higher ed, it doesn't matter if it's in the workforce. We want to do everything we can to prevent the event from happening and at the same time get help for the person who's on the pathway to violence. You still there?
Oops, sorry, I'm talking away on a mute. My question was, that always happens, seems to happen. My question here that I was reading was, we have a limited budget for safety and security. We want to spend our money on something sustainable. How are threat assessment teams sustainable?
This is a great one. When I had our school district won the Readiness and Emergency Management Schools grant twice, and everything that we did had to be sustainable. So what's nice is that your staff members become trained in threat assessments. Your district develops policies and procedures. Well, that one piece of training can last for years. And so you pay once for the training, and you might not have to do it again for another 10, 15 years, depending on the turnover of your staff. And if you send people to be trained, it's a train the trainer program then, and so the cost of it is negligible. You know, we had a stabbing in Utah this week, and you know, people want to put in metal detectors immediately. Well, first of all, metal detectors are very expensive, and the only thing they do is they detect metal. Wouldn't it be a better idea to train our staff members to look at students or staff members who might be on a pathway to violence, so that instead of trying to stop the child when they get to this classroom with the knife, we stop the child before the event even occurs, so that they no longer want to bring a knife to school.
That's great. Thanks, Gary, for taking the time today to talk to us about this important topic. Any last thoughts before we take it on home?
You know, here's the thing. Those of you that are customers with Lenssec and those of you that are listening in, my contact information is there. And I just want to tell you that if you ever have a question or you ever have a concern and you just want to bounce that idea off of someone, the reason why we partner with Lenssec is because we're able to get information out to people at zero cost. And so if you send me an email or if you call me and say, Gary, I have a question, I will gladly answer your question for you, because I remember what it was like when I was the safety director and I had a question and I couldn't get an answer. And so I want to make sure that I can be a resource to you just as Lenssec is a resource to you.
Thanks, Gary. We appreciate it. Yeah, happy Thanksgiving. We appreciate your time today. Don't forget, we'd like for attendees to complete a quick survey at the end of the webinar. On that survey, you can request a completion certificate. We'll email out some of the items we promised on the webinar and include those links as well. And we'll also send out answers to the questions that came in today. This webinar recording will be posted on our video archive on the Lenssec website in just a few days. You'll find that at www.lenssec.com, along with other webinars that we've recorded previously. We'd like to take one last opportunity to thank Gary Sigrist of Safeguard Risk Solutions for taking the time to talk with us today. If we can help with any questions, please contact us. That wraps up our webinar. Thanks, everybody, for attending. We appreciate you.